Good morning. Welcome. I know that you have to battle the cold weather to arrive here, and I'm very grateful that you managed to cross campus and wherever you came from and be here. So my name is Santiago Schnell. I'm the William K. Warren Foundation Dean of the College of Science. And I would like to welcome you today to the Science Exploration series. So since this is our final and very cold game, it is also as well our final and warm Saturday Science lecture of the year. One thing that I love from Notre Dame is that during the football weekends, so we bring the classroom into the Saturday weekend. So you can experience what our students and our faculty have to offer you during the academic year every Saturday. This year we have cracked the mysteries of the brain. We touch a nuclear physics lab, and in fact, many of you who were here have the opportunity to tour that laboratory. We learn how wine is made, and we talk about the importance of having women represented in scientific fields. And if you enjoy these public lectures, so we have as well another one coming in. On December 2nd, we are going to be holding in the evening the second Christmas science lecture at Notre Dame. So if you are in campus, you're more than welcome to come in. And if you're not in campus, you can tune in into the local PBS station on December 21st after Nova, and you can watch the lecture online. And if you don't live in the area, you can call your PBS station and request them to have the Notre Dame Christmas lecture in your TV channel. Our speaker today is Amy Nutt. Amy is a Pulitzer Prize winning neuroscience writer, and she has written 2 best-selling books. So The Teenage Brain, a neuroscience survival guide to raising adolescents and young adults. And you know, I have young adults, and I can tell you I need to read that book. I haven't read it. And Becoming Nicole. She won her Pulitzer Prize in 2011 as features writer for the New York Star Ledger and worked as a neuroscience writer for the Washington Post. Amy has degrees in English and philosophy from Smith College and works toward her PhD at MIT. And she was this close of doing it, but she just didn't write the dissertation. She's a writer. We should push her to do that. So we want her to have the PhD. But not content with this, so she has as well a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University after a very illustrious career working for Sport Illustrated. She's working on her next book called American Madness. It's about the history of mental health treatments in the United States. Her narrative style of writing guarantees that the book will be filled with fascinating stories and anecdotes. While researching this book, she has learned that the trajectory of treating mental health has been vastly different than the progression of treatment of physical health. And, we had the opportunity to chat together. So because my wife is a clinical psychologist and I have experience in medicine outside the United States, and the differences are devastating from what we see here in the United States and elsewhere. So what's going to happen right now is that Amy will speak first, and her brief talk will follow by a fireside chat with our students. So we have here 3 students. Grace Bradley, so lift your hands. Hello. So then we have Esai Omoguanto. So, in addition to us, we have Sam Stevens. So, and what they will do is that they will moderate the discussion. So, and then we will open the questions for audience. And I want to thank you very much, all of you, for coming here today, but particularly for Amy for spending this football weekend with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You have the microphone there.
Am I mic'd already?
Yes, it's on.
Yes, okay. Thank
you.
Thank you very much. So, first of all, thank you, Dean Schnell, especially for that encouragement about the dissertation. Not going to happen. It's the problem when you pick a subject that's been around for, 3,000 years. It's tough to be original. And I think that was what stymied me when I was approaching the idea of doing a dissertation. Okay, no, that's been done. But thank you, Dean Schnell, the College of Science. Thank you, Dina Farrell, the School of Communications, for inviting me, the students. It's been a joyful couple of days meeting people and students and talking to them already. So obviously, the sneeze that Launched Psychoanalysis just brought the hordes in, and I thank you for that. And it is warm here, but I apologize. So this talk is going to be a bit of a sort of a wine tasting tour of American psychiatry, winding up with a bit of a critique about where we are right now. But my apologies, I am going to begin more than 100 years ago, but my apologies if I just hold off for a few moments on a certain sneeze off stage for a few minutes before I bring the sneeze on. So I'm going to work into that. Instead, we begin with a train wreck and a tale told by a physician. In the last half of the 19th century, rail accidents were frighteningly common. Combination of cheap, flimsy railroad construction, increased traffic, and of course, this increased sense of haste that we need to get places faster and faster. 1875, there were about 1,200 train accidents. They didn't keep good records yet. 5 years later, 8,000. So stories like this one that I'm going to read briefly were not unusual. Only recently, I saw a woman who had been in a railway accident and who carried in her bag an illustrated newspaper with a picture of the wrecked train in splinters. She had escaped unhurt, but was very anxious that no one, including myself, should underestimate the horrors through which she had passed. For the first week, she was rather exhilarated by the experience, by the fact that she had been able to help others less fortunate than herself, and by the intense interest taken by all her friends in her adventure. This was followed, though, by an emotional reaction to which some doctor had given the unfortunate name of delayed shock. From that moment, the question of compensation arose and grew. Today, we'd probably more likely say about this woman, if we knew more about what she told that doctor and about her delayed shock, was suffering from PTSD. I don't know if she ever received compensation, but this brief slice of her story reveals several salient points about the peculiarly American history of mental illness and mental health treatment, in this case involving trauma, litigation, and above all else, how is it that we understand and describe a single fractured mind at a particular time in history, which is really at the heart of my upcoming book, American Madness. Back to the railroad story. By the late 1890s, the railroad companies had paid out more than $1 million in compensation to accident victims. Some, like the woman I just mentioned, escaped unscathed, but within days or weeks developed a wide range of symptoms, from general aches and pains to sleeplessness, fatigue, anxiety, restlessness, depression. Most physicians and neurologists considered these amorphous complaints real, with somatic or maybe exacerbated organic origin, even when those somatic or organic origins weren't visible or otherwise detectable. But in 1880 in London, a surgeon suggested that the etiology of these vague complaints maybe wasn't some even invisible lesion on the brain or the spine, but rather psychological in nature. Harvard neurologist, an early supporter of psychoanalysis, James Jackson Putnam, agreed. He called it male hysteria, because a majority of rail passengers back then were men, and therefore a majority of the victims of railway accidents were men. But because most other neurologists remained tethered to this materialistic or somatic notion of diseases, it was called not male hysteria, but railway spine. This became the sort of widely used term at the time for these mysterious ailments of seemingly unscathed accident victims. What made the etiological dispute of more than limited interest to the medical profession were the lawsuits. Most of them legitimate, most of them involving catastrophic physical injuries, but a whole lot involving these psychological ones. And it was these patients without a mark on their body whose tales of woe presented a real problem to railroad companies. Juries, it turned out, were sympathetic to these tales, too unfamiliar with the psychic injuries to question their causes, but sympathetic to these victims. But the railroad companies and their surgeons were interested in the causes. As one wrote, "Railway spine is the nemesis of the modern railway, an ever-to-be-dreaded terror to railway commerce and railway managers. It's time for doctors to define this injury to the courts so that juries may know and locate and apply tests to it which are insisted upon in regard to all other physical injuries. This seems reasonable. It's also very good news for the railroad companies. Enter the National Association of Railway Surgeons, employed by the railroad companies, who began to promote in court testimony a purely psychological explanation for railway spine, that these victims were convinced of their ailments by their physicians that they went to see with these amorphous complaints. Suggestion, wrote Virginia railway surgeon George Roy, is a tremendous factor, and I believe the doctor into whose hands the patient first goes can materially influence the patient in any manner he pleases. In other words, it was the doctors who suggested a patient's headaches or anxieties or restlessness were related to their recent accidents. These suggestions, therefore, shifted the blame for a victim's real ills from the accident itself to the attending physician, as well as sympathetic friends and family and relatives, and yes, of course, lawyers. Really, really good news for the railroad companies, which suddenly weren't liable for compensating accident victims for suggested ills that they may have been caused not by the train wreck itself, but by a patient's suggestibility, by their fragile mind. Suggestion, repression, hysteria, all would eventually become watchwords of Freudian psychoanalysis, but they filtered into this country first through railway accidents, when it finally behooved railway companies to espouse a psychological theory for railway spine, and for which they could not hold companies responsible. Many histories of psychiatry attribute the entrance of psychoanalysis into this country with Freud's one and only introduction to America at Clark University in Worcester in 1909, Worcester, Massachusetts, when he gave a series of 5 lectures. Freud had first published his first psychoanalytic treatise on hysteria in 1895, but his work was not yet available and wouldn't be for some years in translation. In fact, at Worcester, Freud actually gave his talks in German to a mostly erudite professional audience. So you'd be hard-pressed to say psychoanalysis arrived in America with Freud. It's not like it hitchhiked, on a steamer. In fact, the beginnings of American psychoanalysis were already forming, first seeded perhaps by doctors, not by doctors, rather, but by railway attorneys seeking the psychological theory that would best exonerate their corporate clients. At the time of Freud's 1909 visit, the word psychotherapy, certainly not even psychoanalysis, was virtually not found in this country. Enter Smith Eli Jelliff, born in Brooklyn, New York in 1866, an American neurologist, psychiatrist, and psychoanalyst, a broad-thinking, wide-ranging intellect with an MD and a PhD in botany and a mind that liked to make connections. In many ways, he's largely forgotten now. He just finished medical school at Columbia in 1889, when he decided to take a 2-week vacation at the family's camp on Lake George in the Adirondacks. Not yet 23, he brought along a med school classmate who was, frankly, more interested in Jelliff's comely cousin, so Jelliff spent more time with a second friend whom he didn't know quite as well. The two took a daily 1-mile walk to the post office and back every day, and in one of these ambles, the friend shared with Jelliff how excited and happy he'd been the past 2 weeks at this campsite on Lake George. It was the only place where he'd been able to enjoy nature and the outdoors free of the plague of his life, hay fever, from which he'd suffered since he was 12. Jelliff, already an amateur botanist, received his doctorate in another 10 years, wanted to know more, and a friend told him, well, this place in the Adirondacks was clearly completely free of ragweed. So he'd been free of his allergies the entire time he was there and able to really enjoy fresh air for the first time in years. Jelliff was still virginal when it came to the ways of psychotherapy, but botanically, he was an old master, and he immediately chimed in, telling his naive guest, oh, no, this mountain lake camp where we're staying, abundant growth of not just one, but two types of ragweed. Within 5 minutes, Jelliff later wrote, his friend started violently sneezing, gripped by an allergy attack he was helpless to control. For Jelliff, it's only 23. It was a seminal moment, a realization of the strange workings of the human mind, undeniable proof of this powerful mind-body connection, that by his doing nothing more than talking about the presence of ragweed, his friend, though symptom-free of allergies for weeks and having frequently traversed that very road with Jelliff without incident, was suddenly in the throes of a hay fever attack. Today, Jelliff is rightly regarded as one of the founders of psychosomatic medicine, although that incident isn't often talked about, and I don't know why. His 1918 tome, The Technique of Psychoanalysis, was the first book of any language explicitly devoted to psychoanalytic technique. That's less than a decade after Freud came here to give his talk. Before Freud's books were barely translated into English, Jelliff was promoting these ideas of suggestion, repression, hypnosis, and trauma. He edited many journals, books. He had one of the largest libraries of neuroscience in the world. Unfortunately, he lost all of his money in the stock market crash in 1929, had to work well into his 70s, but was a teacher at Columbia and Fordham and brought his ideas to as many students as he could. He had an effect. Theories blossom out of individual experiences of people like Jelliff, but also, importantly, from whenever the current pressures are in society, culturally, economically, sociologically, politically. You could go on and on. The railway spine of the mid-1800s became the neurasthenia of the late 1800s and early 1900s, when electricity, not railroads, heralded the further advance of industrialization. Electricity was the lens through which we viewed the world and through which we viewed our brains and our bodies. Therefore, neurasthenia, which was the depletion of nervous energy, without which we couldn't properly function, became the byword. Advances in civilization increased the drain of that nervous energy, and the result for some were nervous breakdowns. Nervous breakdowns comes out of the age of electricity. In the 1920s, jazzmania, not actually in the DSM, jazzmania was a popular expression for abnormal behavior, excessive dancing, drinking, sex, and worst of all, believe it or not, well, smoking. With the advent of World War II, psychiatrists and analysts to American troops in the South Pacific wrote about Guadalcanal neurosis, experienced by what World War I would have called shell-shocked Marines, or in the Civil War, soldiers suffering from soldiers' heart. Today, we know it as PTSD. Back then in World War II, these symptoms were caused by weeks of ambushes and hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers. And you can read some of these memoirs of these soldiers and some of the medical notes from these doctors at the time, and they're harrowing, truly harrowing. After the Second World War, we were thrust into an arms race with Russia amid fears of nuclear annihilation, right? Frank Ellis, director of the Office of Civil Defense and Mobilization, said at the time, certain people seem to be afflicted by a new and dreadful disease, which has been called nuclearosis of the brain. It's a malady wherein one is so overwhelmed by the destructive power of nuclear weapons that he can no longer think objectively on the subject of national defense. In the 1960s and 70s, protest psychosis became a common expression. An ad, a pharmaceutical ad, in the archives of general psychiatry, had already been around for decades. In 1974, featured a black man with a raised fist who actually looked not unlike a Natalie dressed but slightly crazed James Brown. And the words above, assaultive and belligerent, question mark, cooperation often begins with Haldol. Yeah, for those of you who may not be familiar with Haldol, it's a powerful old antipsychotic, a sedative, primarily used back then on people with severe schizophrenia. And before protest psychosis singled out blacks, runaway slaves in the 1840s were described as suffering from gepetomania, an irrational impulse to escape, to be free. Why irrational? Because slaves weren't considered civilized enough to be able to handle freedom, so it was irrational that they desired it. What do these examples mean? Precisely this. Those who treat the mentally ill, no matter what time or geographical place in history, self-select the symptoms that define that illness. Why is that so troublesome? Because the authority of any doctor depends on his or her ability to name a patient's suffering. For patients to accept a diagnosis, they must believe that doctors know, in the same way that physicians know about gravity or biologists about cell formation, that their disease exists and that they have it. But this kind of certainty has always eluded psychiatry. And every fight over nomenclature threatens to undermine the legitimacy of the profession by revealing its dirty secret. That for all their confident pronouncements, psychiatrists can't rigorously differentiate illness or disease from everyday suffering. There is a terrible sense of shame among psychiatrists, wrote one doctor some 50 years ago, always wanting to show that our diagnoses are good as the scientific ones used in real medicine. That's his quote. It's not just that we don't know the cause of a single mental illness or that we don't have any cures. It's that we have hundreds of diagnoses and scores of medications for illnesses for which there are no known causes or cures. Here's the problem for the study of mental illness. In psychiatry, culture shapes what we deem pathological. In medicine, culture does not shape, ultimately, the definition of a brain tumor, of breast cancer, of TB, or cardiac arrest. We can identify cancer under a microscope, a staph infection from a blood sample, glaucoma from pressure on the eyelids, but there is no medical test for mental illness. There is nothing to look at, palpate, or discover in a scan, no place in the body or brain where it can be found, and no current pharmaceutical that will cure it. As psychiatry has taken on the mantle of medicine, we have been blinded to the most profound difference between it and all other scientific disciplines. In psychiatry, it's almost impossible to disprove anything. For that reason alone, psychiatry remains susceptible to political and historical exigencies, ever-changing diagnostic menus, psychotherapeutic and pharmaceutical fads, and the power of a single individual or event to shape our understanding of what mental illness is and how it should be treated. To an unprecedented extent, psychiatric theories are abolished not by empirical evidence or scientific data, not by scientific revolutions, but by consensus, cultural consensus, which is why psychiatry is the only medical specialty whose fundamental principles have been torn down and rebuilt from scratch over and over, time and again. We've moved from moral treatment in the 18th century to the mind cure movement and the mental hygiene movement in the 19th, to psychoanalysis in the 20th, to biological psychiatry in the 21st, and every sub-movement, fad, and psychotherapeutic in between. The resounding lesson of the history of mental illness in America over the past 2.5 centuries is that we are ignorant of that history, of the meaning of that history, and the consequences of our obtuseness or hubris, or both, is that in many ways we are a sicker society today. Since the 1960s, treatment approaches have grown from 60 to 400 plus, and diagnostic categories from 24 to more than 260. 1 in 5 women takes an antidepressant. For women in their 40s and 50s, that ratio is 1 in 4. And yet the number of middle-aged women who take their own lives has nearly doubled since 1999. And we're seeing trends like that now with young people. 40% of non-medicated schizophrenic patients recover enough to be self-supporting. Only 5% of schizophrenic patients on psychiatric drugs do. Managed care has made long-term treatment a thing of the past. Hospital emergency rooms have become warehouses for the most severely ill patients, giving rise to the phrase psychiatric boarding. Days, even weeks go by, where those patients essentially live in the ER, waiting for an inpatient bed to become available. The chemical imbalance theory of neurotransmitters has been debunked, and overly positive studies, hundreds of them, of modern antidepressants have been reevaluated to reveal less than stellar results. The truth of the matter is, we are still in the dark ages when it comes to offering meaningful treatments, much less identifying biological causes. Symptoms of mental illnesses are the lightning in the zeitgeist, the product of culture and belief in specific times and specific places that reveal nothing about an actual case, only the pain of the individual sufferer. The discovery of treatments for medical diseases and mental illnesses are in no way parallel, except that both can begin, sometimes accidentally. Medical treatments are continually refined, disease processes identified, genetic mutations uncovered, epigenetic influences revealed. In 1600 BC in Egypt, breast cancer tumors were treated with a fire stick to burn or cauterize bulging tumors on the chest. Then it was frogs' oils and herbal potions, crab powder, even wolf's tongue. Those were used by the ancient Romans. By the start of the 17th century, surgery was being performed. By the 20th century, it was radiation, then chemotherapy. By the 21st, genomic testing brought us personalized immunotherapy. We have advanced in our understanding and treatment of cancer in a largely linear fashion. The more we understand and learn about human physiology and genetics, the better the treatments. What about mental illnesses? Sadly, there is nothing linear about its advances over time. In the 20th century, we had psychosurgery, electric shock, electric stimulation, psychedelics, and pills. In the 21st century, we have electric shock, electromagnetic stimulation, psychedelics, and pills. Only psychosurgery, thank God, has fallen by the wayside. There are more tree surgeons in the United States than practicing psychiatrists in 2019. But at the same time, there has been a 500% increase in the use of antidepressants since the 1980s, even while suicide is on the rise. More than twice as many people take their own lives in America every year than are murdered. What does this say about the state of the science of mental illness? One psychologist wrote this. A string of raw facts, a little gossip and wrangle about opinions, a little classification and generalization on the mere descriptive level, a strong prejudice that we have states of mind and that our brain conditions them, but not a single law in the sense in which physics shows us laws, not a single proposition from which any consequence can causally be deduced. This is no science. It is only the hope of a science. That was written 134 years ago by the psychologist and philosopher William James in 1892. But it sounds familiar. In May of 1957, Aldous Huxley, the English author, philosopher, social critic, published an obscure article called The History of Tension, in which he wrote, the title of this paper is somewhat misleading, for, strictly speaking, the history of tension does not exist. Tension is a form of disease, and diseases, as such, are beyond the scope of history. There is no such thing as a medieval stomachache, a Victorian neuralgia, or a New Deal epilepsy. So far as the patient is concerned, the symptoms of his illness are a completely personal experience, an experience to which the public life of nations, the events recorded in the headlines or discussed in scientific journals and literary reviews are totally irrelevant. Disease, as an actual experience, is more or less completely independent of time and place. Consequently, there cannot be a history of disease as experience there can only be a history of medicine. No one would argue with Huxley that pain itself, especially emotional and mental pain, is an entirely subjective experience. But insofar as there cannot be a history of diseases, especially mental diseases or illnesses, he was spectacularly wrong. Don't get me wrong. There is no triumph in saying that. If it's true that our understanding of defining, describing, and treating of mental illnesses are more or less byproducts of culture and accidents of history, does not mean they don't exist. Nor does our misunderstanding of the uses and consequences of medication mean they don't often work. What it does mean is we must be more clear-eyed about the history of American madness, and we must be laser-focused on this. What do we want that history to tell us next? Thank you. You got the sneeze, right? Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Amy, for that wonderful talk. We have a couple questions for you, and then we'll open it up to the floor if anybody has any other questions. First, why do you believe that mental health and the history of psychoanalysis is an important topic for people to understand?
Well, I mean, psychoanalysis I picked out because it comes at an interesting point, a very American point in explaining that history. But I always assumed before I went into doing the research for this book that it was something that was going to be fairly linear, that it made sense. In fact, I proposed doing this book with the beginnings of biological psychiatry, which, as you probably all know, began January 19th, 1952 at 10 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time in Paris, France, with the first infusion of Thorazine into a psychotic patient. No, I was wrong. What I've learned in the research is you could say biological psychiatry began decades earlier than that, at the turn of the 20th century when endocrinology first came on board, and we thought hormones, was what caused insanity, and that was every time. It's the wonderful part about the American spirit and American optimism is that we think that the more we learn, the answers are going to become clear. But it takes longer than that. And so what I also discovered is that people have come along who have had really good ideas about community care, about occupational therapy, about what we do about PTSD in every war we've ever had, but we seem to forget these things when those moments in history are past. And so we have to keep relearning these things. So I think if we can understand this history better and understand the limitations of biological psychiatry, it's really important. It's really important right now because at NIMH, which controls the largest fund of research dollars for looking into the causes of mental illness, you literally, and I've interviewed many scientists, you literally can't get a grant unless you use the word biomarker. They're really, really only interested in what are the causes. And yet, Thomas Insel, the former head of NIMH, who I interviewed 8 years ago now, really smart guy and retired a few years ago, he wrote a book last year in which he basically admits it's maybe not exactly the best approach right now. And he had a great example. He had a couple come up to him who had a teenage son with severe mental illness, suicidal. And the father said to him, he said, "Our house is on fire. And what you're doing is talking about the chemistry of the paint in the kitchen. How is that going to help us?" And it's a powerful anecdote and frankly a powerful admission of how we get tunnel vision about where we need to find solutions. What we need to do is invest dollars in looking at treatments. And unless we understand how we've had good ideas along the way and how we've gotten lost and how we need to understand, the medicalization of mental illness means, we need to rethink. We need to rethink.
Thank you very much.
So kind of as a follow-up to that question, do you feel that writing about mental illness can change public policy, and have you seen evidence of this?
Man, I really hope so. I really, really hope so. So my beat for 5 years at the Washington Post was neuroscience, and which grew out of philosophy, believe it or not, and mental health. And every single day there's positive news, and there are things going on, and there are things to learn. And it's exciting. And, with COVID, I was gone when COVID happened, and sort of feel guilty that I wasn't there for that. But, I think it's important to, what's your question?
Do you feel that writing about mental illness
Yes.
can change public policy?
So, yes. It can, when you shine a light in certain ways and you get to talk to people. Now, it was great. I worked at the Washington Post, and I'm right there in Washington, D.C., and IMH, and I get to talk to and interview Tom Insel. I don't know if the things that I write about has an influence at all on them, but I know it does on readers. And I know it does because I've written things that have helped clarify. And anytime, it's what I encourage science writers especially, to know what you're doing, to be able to, look at the studies and know which of the studies that need to be highlighted and which ones aren't. I once asked a scientist, why is it that we see headlines all the time? Great advance in, mouse study shows that Alzheimer's completely reversed and, memories restored and all that, and then you never hear about the development. And this wonderful scientist explained it to me very simply. He said, because mice don't get Alzheimer's. Humans do. So we have to genetically modify a mouse to show signs, artificial signs, of what Alzheimer's looks like in humans. So whatever experiments we do on them, we can't do them on humans, but we're doing it on an artificial, basis. And that's all we have right now, but there's a limitation to that. And I think that's why it's important for people who communicate science to the public to take subjects like that announce these fabulous results when it's really about rodents and modulate that enthusiasm, or at least add in the information that we have to be careful about, that we can't immediately transfer that and translate that to humans.
Oftentimes, scientific writing, especially neuroscience, can be seen as elusive to the rest of the general public. As a journalist, how do you try and combat that in your writing?
You think it's elusive to the public, or?
Yes, oftentimes just general scientific papers that come out.
So I'm going to suggest something I often tell students, and I've talked about here, and this is kind of in the weeds, but it's really important, and that is your ability to make analogies is really, really important. It's not about dumbing down, it's about giving examples. When you're talking about esoteric subjects like neuroscience, it's really important to use examples. And when you're talking to a scientist, say, can you give me an example of a real case? Or can you use an analogy, to show what that's like? You have to visualize, you have to tell a story. And you tell a story through people, through analogies, and so storytelling is an important ingredient for any kind of writing. I think it's really, really important for science writing because it's a little bit harder, and you want your reader to stay with you. So it's more incumbent upon you to be not only clear and concise, but to use language that helps you illuminate a subject. It's not easy, but we need it, and it's the most important kind of, it's not my bailiwick, actually. I'm a long-form narrative writer, but I think right now, in journalism at least, and communications, is some of the most important writing that's being done for the public. Absolutely.
Thank you, Amy. It's also very interesting that you mentioned William James in your talk. I'm a little bit familiar with him from the philosophy of mind, and kind of similar to what you were mentioning about psychiatry and psychology being in a little bit of a state of darkness right now. It's very similar with philosophy of mind and really discovering consciousness, both from a neuroscientific perspective and also a philosophical one. So as a writer of neuroscience and also with your philosophy background, what are your thoughts on the best approach to discovering what the nature of consciousness is?
Oh, okay. I didn't know that was going to be your question. I tend to take a broad approach. We talked a little bit earlier. I am like those are questions that have always fascinated me. And I came to them naturally through philosophy, my sort of failed philosophy career. I was interested in questions about identity and consciousness. And so I've written a lot in neuroscience about the search for the sources of consciousness. And I think that the best thing to do is to be widely read, to know what the basic theories are, the hard problem of consciousness and the soft problem and materialism, and to know what questions to ask people, and to sort of keep a wide view so that you sort of see the current popularity, and it usually has to do with who are the strongest voices, and sometimes simply who are the strongest writers in presenting their ideas. And Dan Dennett, as we've discussed, who once hired me to teach intro philosophy at Tufts, is, as a materialist, one of the most brilliant writers of the subject and has a strong influence. But again, it's being able to convey those ideas to a public. But I think in the study of philosophy of mind, it's to read widely and also to read in the past. William James, and basically, a lot of you probably know, the whole idea of stream of consciousness was his, and he was obviously the brother to Henry James. So he was also someone who suffered depression all of his life and wrote about it. So he had a keen personal interest in these subjects, and he was also a gorgeous writer. His Principles of Psychology is beautiful to read, and obviously a seminal work. And I'm doing a lot of research now, he took his class in abnormal psychology in the 1890s to mental hospitals to watch psychiatrists doing what was brand new back then, and that was interviewing psychiatric patients to find out their life history. That had never been done before, not until the late 1800s and the early 1900s with Adolf Meyer, another forgotten name in the history of psychiatry.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then question about, sort of regarding your philosophy background, does that influence the way that you write even today? In some philosophy classes, we've kind of been instructed to write in a very certain manner, which might be different from an English class. How does that sort of play into your writing today?
I'll be really honest with you. Philosophy motivates me to look at those questions, but what organizes my writing is actually my love of poetry. And I've often given talks on the Walt Whitman School of Science Writing, because I had an editor once say to me, the success of your story about the beginning of the universe is going to rise or fall on your ability to make analogies. And where do you best find analogies? In poetry, in metaphor, analogies, in precise description, in the use of unusual words to bring out what those meanings are, the use of things like synesthesia. I love the music of poetry, but I look at Emily Dickinson, A Certain Slant of Light, Zero at the Bone, her expressions of how we visualize mental things. Poetry to me is one of the best examples of that. So it's why in a college education, I tell young journalists, you don't have to major in journalism. Take all the journalism courses you can, but take other courses. I use my geology, my little bit of geology, my little bit of astronomy. I forgot to take calculus. So it kind of makes some counting mistakes sometimes, but you use all that. You use everything in your life. And that's the beauty of being a journalist, is you draw on those things. And in college, the beauty of being a student is that you use all of that to be a communicator.
Sure. So speaking a little bit more about your writing process, what would you say is the hardest part for you during this book writing process?
Oh, during the book writing process. The whole idea of it seems, wow, that's going to be fun, write a book. And this is my fourth book, and it's not fun. But here's the beauty. I'm a journalist. Dean and I have discussed this. Most journalists, they really love the research and the interviewing, but they don't really like the writing, or they really don't like the reporting, but they really love the writing. I'm really lucky. I geek out on both. I love to do the research. I love to do the reporting and the interviewing, and I love to do the writing. And when one thing gets to be a slog, I move over to the other and do a little bit of that. But I'm always motivated by a natural sense of curiosity and wonder, and Aristotle and Plato both have said, the mark of a true philosopher is the capacity to wonder. I think that's the mark of a true journalist, too. And if you have a natural sense of wonder and curiosity about the world, it will take you everywhere, no matter what you do in life, but especially in journalism, because it will take you to subjects you had no idea you'd be interested in or be able to write about. Yeah.
Sure. I think it's now time that we could open up the floor to questions from the audience.
Smaller. Is there anything that you know that's related to the history of mental illness in that way?
Yeah. So you're talking about other countries and other societies that have done it differently. And yes. I mean, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I'm spending so much time sort of in the particularly American story. But yes, one of the things that I will get to in my book towards the end is I don't want to end like, all hope is lost. Not at all. We are making progress in certain ways. But I think other countries have done things differently. If you look up, for instance, the story of Geel, Belgium, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, Gheel, they have a fascinating long history of hundreds of years of community-centered, basically, psychiatry, of communities taking care of the mentally ill. Italy has a program in that too. Societies that are more homogeneous than ours can do it a little bit better, and certainly societies that have different economic structures and different government structures. Community care, there's no doubt that that has been something that has worked in other places around the world and would work here, but here is one of the main problems and the accidents of history. JFK signed that bill of the community care in 1963, 3 weeks before he was assassinated. That bill was signed, it was ready to go, but when Johnson came in, a lot of that money was then used to prosecute the Vietnam War. The little money that there had been probably wasn't enough to be able to sustain it, to start the program, but not to keep it going. And that's often what we do. We give the money to start it, but we don't put the money in to keep it going. And so community care has been like a scattered approach all over the United States. But I think time and again, that's one of these fundamental basic things that we show works. NIMH did a schizophrenia study that showed communication and groups and all of that appears to be one of the best solutions for schizophrenic patients. And a lot has been written about that. I'm not sure where it stands right now, because I've sort of been out of that right now, but reporting about it at least. But we have done the work a little bit to show that there are certain things like psychotherapy, which is broken. That whole system is broken right now. That having a one-to-one connection, as simple as that, has proved to be at least as much benefit, probably more than medication. Medication and communication and psychotherapy together have proved the most success. But we get laser focused on one thing and we let other things fall by the wayside. We have to have a more global approach to things. But there have been times in our history where certain instances of community care, and this is especially true in other countries, have absolutely worked. We need to grab onto those things and then get money for them.
On the same lines, I mean, you look at France, and they hardly treat anybody for ADD. They don't treat depression that much. They do a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, and they do much better. But I was wondering, the profoundly mentally disabled, schizophrenia, you can't solely treat that with cognitive behavioral therapy. Where are we with treating that? I mean, we can prevent the hallucinations and auditory hallucinations but we see them, unfortunately, when they get off their medications or are homeless in all the big cities. So yes, a lot of diseases don't need drugs, but some diseases do need drugs. And how close are we to coming up with medication that can be used for like a depot injection, where they can, it works for 3 months and they just have to get, a depot shot.
Yeah.
Do you know?
On the one hand, I think that is a big crisis of ours that has been neglected, the most seriously mentally ill, because there's nothing for them. All the hospitals are gone, the long-term hospitals, everything is short-term. And I talked to a scientist who was an ER physician who did a study about the mentally ill because of her experience in a Chicago hospital, I can't remember which one, where she kept coming back on rotation and seeing the same patient over weeks, still in the ER. That was what motivated her to try and get funding to do a study about it. There are a couple of things out there. The most important right now for people who are seriously suicidally depressed, not necessarily schizophrenic, and that's ketamine. Controversial. It's a party drug that was abused in the past, but they have discovered that this is the fastest acting drug that they have found. I know someone personally who's been using it, who has used medications for 30 years that haven't helped, and she's responding to it. We don't know how long it lasts. Clinics are being set up all over the United States by anesthesiologists because ketamine is a drug that's used in anesthesiology, so they can do that. These are not places we need to be sending people to, not to anesthesiologists, sorry. So we need to pay attention, but American cupidity kind of gets ahead of us sometimes. But there are things like that. There are serious limitations there. But for the treatment of schizophrenia, no. I mean, Abilify is an antipsychotic. The antipsychotics that are used today are mostly off-label for sleep, for anxiety, for marriage problems. Abilify, 5 or 6 years ago, when it was still protected by, patent, was the #1 best-selling pharmaceutical, not psychiatric drug, pharmaceutical in the United States. Okay? Not for blood pressure, an antipsychotic, and not because it's being prescribed for schizophrenia, but for everything else. It's fallen down since it's come off patent, but that, and I know because you see a lot of ads that these are antipsychotics that are being promoted on ads on TV. You see them all the time for depression. If your antidepressant isn't working, try Latuda. Guess what? I tried Latuda. I almost had a stroke. I'm bipolar. Medication has been a savior for me, but I'm on the smallest amount now than I ever was. I spent my 20s and 30s in and out of mental hospitals. I've had shock treatment. I've been there. I know what I'm talking about. That I am here today talking to you and writing a book is a miracle that I attribute absolutely in part that I had a response to medication, whether it was placebo effect or whatever, I don't know, and I don't care. But it worked for me. And so I'm not in a position to dismiss any of that. Not even shock treatment, although I don't really honestly know if it helped, but my doctor said it got me to a place where my medication could start to help. All I know is I'm here today and I'm writing, and I never thought I would be able to do that. So I'm not an anti-psychiatry person by any means, but we have to open our eyes and our minds, and we have to look more broadly and more sensibly. And what do we need right now? So we need treatments, any kind of treatment, not necessarily medication, right? And we have to find the ones that work, that get people talking to each other. Oh.
Thanks for the presentation today. My question is, how does your philosophical background help you shape your interviewing style as a journalist?
My what style? My writing style?
Interviewing style.
Oh, my interviewing. That's a really interesting question. Well, I think one thing it attunes me to is, you have to get all the details, right? The who, what, when, and where. but you also want to ask the deeper questions and, what a person thinks about, what they're feeling at a moment. And one thing I tell journalists too is you might be reporting and doing a story about like a seminal event in someone's life and something has just happened. What I want to know is what are they thinking and feeling about after that event? What happens afterwards? How does it change them? And it's as simple as the story for which I won a Pulitzer, The Wreck of the Lady Mary, about a scallop ship that sank off the coast of Cape May in 2009. 6 men died, only 1 survived, right? And I wanted to know the rescue swimmer who saved, the Coast Guard rescue swimmer who saved the one person and also brought up 2 bodies. I asked him about that, and it's a great description he gave me. And he's like wearing, all of this weight and going through these waves to save this person and to bring up these bodies. And he's working on a body that he knows he can't recover from. He's not going to wake up. And I got all of that. And then I asked him, so what did you do afterwards? He said, well, I drove home. And I said, all right. And, and he told me that he drove a cool car. And and he listened to the radio, and he said, and then I turned it off, and I said, well, what were you thinking about? And he said, I thought about what was it going to feel like the next day, and the next day after that. What was this experience going to be like? And then he went out and he surfed for 2 hours because he lived at the Jersey Shore, and that was how he, processed it. And I think that's important. You want to know about what happens to a person in the moment, what they're doing, what their role is, but these are human beings. I also want to know, because I'm just really curious, what is it like then after all of that? And one of the hardest things that I had to learn as a journalist, Dina, you know this, one of the hardest things to do is to be quiet. That when you ask a question of someone, especially if it's about what they're thinking about or something emotional, our tendency is, when they finish answering, is to ask another question. But if you keep quiet and let that awkward silence take place, that other person will fill it in, and they will often fill it in with some of the most moving quotes that I've gotten from people happen in that silence, where I'm just waiting. It's really hard to do. It's socially very awkward. But you have to be thinking about the other person. It's, using your theory of mind, right? Thinking about what it's like for the other person. And to get at that, you just got to get them to talk. You just have to get them to talk. But you have to be quiet sometimes to do that. And not everyone is a thinker like that. And some people you interview, and it's, pretty simple stuff, and you're not going to get more than that. But you know when you're talking to someone, you get a sense of their self-awareness and all of that. And when you do, you want to linger. You definitely want to linger with them. Really interesting question.
Any more questions? I think this will be our last question, and then we'll...
Thank you. What is the difference in your mind between symptoms of mental illness and the illness itself?
Well, that's what it's all about. We don't know. And this is why it's so difficult to do studies. You do a study, and this is why studies of antidepressants fail. Because to do a study of an antidepressant, you have to get depressed people, right? You think that's easy. Raise your hand, you've been depressed, But then when you take a life history of that person, some person's depression is much more about anxiety. Some people, it's more about OCD. Some people, it's that they're catatonic. Some people, it's like they're restless. That's the problem. We talk about it's depression. It is. It's a sense of helplessness. I've been there. And even my depressions have been different, right? So how do you do a study of an antidepressant if you're studying depressed people, if depression is this wide open thing? It's really hard to do that. And frankly, the gold standard of, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies don't bring out the best results. And this is a problem. I don't know what the solution to it is. I think we have to get back somehow to doing better life histories of people and better interviewing. It's why it bothers me that psychiatrists now primarily are 4 people an hour for 15 minutes, and it's about medication. I've had wonderful psychiatrists, but when I started out in the mental health system, that wasn't what it was about. They're doing the medication and someone else is doing the therapy, and a lot of times they're not even talking. So a psychiatrist is getting a few snapshot symptoms here and there. And then they'll come back in a month and they'll have a different symptom, so they'll add a different medication. You look at it with a long lens and you realize, no, it's not about adding another medication. But it's about spending more time with someone to know what are their individual situations, what are their individual symptoms, and what's best for them. And we do know the differences in certain medications. The serotonin hypothesis is a fraud. Not on purpose, but I mean, we thought, oh, serotonin, that's great. We don't know what the right level of serotonin is supposed to be in the brain. There are people with lots of serotonin who are really depressed. Some people who are generally depressed, and who have lots of serotonin. So it ain't about a chemical imbalance. It could be about, brain activity and what's hooking up with what. So the best thing to do is sort of personalized medicine, not in this sort of genomic way, although maybe we can get to that, but dealing with what is certain person's symptoms and what are the best things. And it might be more cognitive behavioral therapy than a medication. It might be a combination of that. I've seen therapists at different points in my life. I see one now where I do much more cognitive behavioral therapy. It's much more helpful to me. And I'm on minimal amount of medication. So at this point in my life, and I don't think that would have been appropriate maybe for 30 years earlier when I was going through, a psychotic break or something like that. So unfortunately, our bodies are also changing along the way too. It's so complex. It's so complex. It's why I was telling these fabulous young people, especially neuroscience majors, when I graduated from college in 1977, neuroscience as a subject didn't exist. You couldn't major in neuroscience. There was no such thing. We're just beginning to understand. So it is a fabulous question, and I wish I had a better answer for you. But the problem of defining is really complex when you don't know a cause and all you have are symptoms, and the symptoms are vast. It's really, really tough. Wow, that didn't help you at all, did it? Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great questions. Thank you very much.